In this exercise, the original instructions ask you to use Access 2010, but since I know that many of you won't have Access 2010 software, I decided to alter this exercise a little bit and just show you what the Access database looks like and how the process will go to import the data from Access into an Excel spreadsheet. First of all, I'll open the Access database file. And if you've never used Access before, this area on the left here is called the navigation pane, and it shows all of the objects inside of the database. In this case, we've got 3 tables and 4 queries. First of all, we're going to take a look at the relationship between the tables by going to the Database Tools tab and choosing Relationships. In the introductory videos, you saw that in Access, tables are related to each other by a common field that relates the 2 tables. For instance, here we have the product table with a primary key of product ID, which would be a unique identifier for products in the table. That is related to vendor product inventory, again through the product ID. The vendor product inventory table has a complicated or a complex primary key. It actually requires 2 separate IDs, the combination of these 2 separate IDs to identify items uniquely in the vendor product inventory. This is because this table would hold products that are identified by vendors. Vendors may have the same type of product or the same product ID, but when we combine these 2 keys together, that combination has to be unique for every individual record or item in this vendor product inventory table. And then the vendor table is related also to the vendor product inventory, again through the vendor ID, just like we said. So a unique vendor and product ID combination combine to make the vendor product inventory records. But each vendor is also uniquely identified in its own table, where we keep the information about the vendor, like the vendor name, the furniture margin, the accessory margin, and so forth. If we open up the product table by double-clicking it, this opens up the product table in what we call data sheet view, which you'll notice looks very much like a spreadsheet, but it is a table of records. Each of the columns is an individual field, and each row is a record. At the bottom, we have a navigation area that tells us that we are on record 1 of 57. So there are 57 records in this table. You can see the product ID that uniquely identifies each record and the product names. You might see duplicates in this type of a column because the other fields besides the key do not have to be unique. So in the product name, we can have really anything that we want to use to describe that product. The industry standard cost is also a field in this table, and we also have assigned each item to a category. We've got furniture, accessories, linens, and clothing. If we look at the vendor table, we'll see that we have 5 vendors, and the vendor names are another field, the furniture margin, accessory margin, and so forth. So these are values in there. You might notice that there's a plus sign next to each of the vendors, and you would have seen this in the introductory video where when we have a relationship created in the table that has a relationship with another table, clicking the plus sign will show you all the records in the other table that are related to the record in the current table. So clicking the plus sign on vendor ID 1 shows us all the product IDs that are related to vendor ID 1. So this shows us that vendor ID 1 has product ID 2, with a quantity on hand of 47, product ID 22 with a quantity on hand of 13, and so forth. Now finally, vendor product inventory table. It actually has a record for each unique combination of vendor ID and product ID. And as you saw before, when we clicked on vendor ID, you saw that it was related to product ID 2, and we also saw that it was related to product ID, I believe, 47. Let me click back just to make sure. I'm sorry, 22. So there's vendor ID 1 related to product ID 22. So we could find all of those relationships in this table. At the moment, I'm not sure what this table would have been created for. It's a utility table because it takes the combination of the relationships between the other two tables and just creates a new record, a new unique record in this table. It would have some purpose, but we don't know at the moment what it is. So this table will, it may be apparent later on in the exercise. So we see what's in all of the tables. I'll close them back up. And we also saw that we had something called a query as an object that is in this database also. And if you remember from the introductory video, a query is a question that we ask of the database. We're asking to select certain records based on a criteria that we define. And we're asked to look at query inventory cost in our instructions. So query inventory cost is requesting the records that we see here, and we'll take a look at how query inventory cost is defined to determine what is what we're seeing here. We see that this query is pulling the product name, industry standard cost, category, quantity on hand, vendor name, and product inventory cost. We'll see in a minute that product inventory cost is actually a calculated field. All of these other fields are pulled from either the product table or the vendor table, and they're put together in this query. So to see exactly how this query is being created, we'll go to the design view, and we'll take a look at the grid here. At the top, we just see the tables that are involved. It's the same grouping of tables that we saw before, and we see the relationships here also. So the query has been created by pulling product name from the product table, industry standard cost from the product table, category from the product table, quantity on hand from the vendor product inventory, vendor name from the vendor table, and notice that this product inventory cost field does not have a table. That's because it is a calculation. Product inventory cost is defined as product from the product table, the industry standard cost multiplied by, from the vendor product inventory table, the quantity ordered. So that is where that field is coming from. So we're saying that this product inventory cost that we're calculating is the result of multiplying the industry standard cost for each item in that product table by the number of those items that we have on hand that we have in that vendor product inventory table. And now we see that is why we have this vendor product inventory table, just so that we can hold the quantity on hand of each item. That is a unique item for the vendor and product. So that's the purpose for this table now. So remember from the introductory video that a query requests records from tables in the database based on certain criteria. In this case, we really don't have any criteria that's narrowing the data that comes into this query. We're not limiting it to anything because we don't have anything in the criteria rows here. But what we are doing is we're pulling the various columns from the different tables and also calculating a column in the query based on data in the two tables. Now we are going to take a look at these other queries, sum of inventory cost by category, sum of inventory cost by vendor, and sum of inventory cost by vendor and category. First of all, sum of inventory cost by category. Inside of the product table, if you recall, and I'll open it up just quickly, each of the products was assigned a category. So they could be furniture, accessories, linens, and clothing. Well, what this query is doing is summing up everything that was in the accessories category, summing up the inventory cost of everything that was in the accessories category, everything that was in the clothing category, furniture, and linens. So let's take a look at what is creating this query. We'll go to the design view. What we see here is that we are taking this field called sum of inventory cost. It actually comes from the query inventory cost that we just looked at. We're taking that field that we calculated in that other query and summing it up based on the category, and we're grouping by category. You're not going to have to know how to create a query like this, but I wanted you to see what is making that query sum up the values that we see when we look at the datasheet view. So those two columns that we saw in the design grid of the query are what we're seeing here. This is the result, that we are summing up that product inventory cost in the inventory cost query, and we're summing it by category, or we're grouping it by category. Similarly, in the vendor, sum of inventory cost by vendor, we are grouping that same, those same records, but we're grouping them now by vendor. So if we looked at the vendor table, we would see Illumination, Team Supplies, Webster, Grant Sales, Copper River. That is what, those are the grouping. That's how we're grouping. And so you see all of those same vendors, and we are summing up the inventory cost for each of those vendors. These are actually the queries that we're going to be importing into Excel. And I will make that import and make the Excel file available to you. If you happen to have access, I'm also going to give you this database file that I'm looking at. And you can, if you are interested, take a look at these same tables in the database and these same queries. And you can actually start from the beginning of the instructions if you like. You don't have to, that's optional, because not everyone will be able to do that. If you do not have access, I'll ask you to start from step 6 under the steps that we're beginning with. It's actually step A6, but in the instructions I point you to that, where you will open up the Excel file that I'm just about to create. So now I will close up the access file. In your instructions, if you have access, or if you were following the instructions from the beginning, you're asked to create or to open up a blank spreadsheet. We are going to import into the Excel spreadsheet the data that we need to create the charts that we're asked to create, but we're going to import that data from those access queries that you just saw. So to import into Excel from Access, we go to the Data tab and then to the From Access item on the Data tab. We'll find that Access file and open it, or choose it. And then we have the queries and tables. So the first chart that we're asked to do is a pie chart on, grouped by vendor. So a pie chart, if you think about it, is just totals by category. It shows you pieces of a whole. So we're going to need to use the query that is categorized by vendor for that particular pie chart. And so we'll choose that and click OK. further, we're asked to import it as a table, so we'll leave the default that we see here and click OK. And there's the data that we saw in the Access table just a moment ago. Next, we'll go to a new blank sheet and import the data for the bar chart that we're asked to do. Again, we go to the Data tab. From Access, we select the file. And this time we're choosing the vendor of inventory cost by category. Again, it's into a table. And here's the data that we need for that chart. Now from here, I'm going to leave everything as is. This is the file that I will upload into Blackboard for you to work on. If I go back to sheet 1, if you are interested in looking at the properties of a table inside of Access, now notice this is just a spreadsheet. It's not really a relational database like Access, but we can do some interesting information gathering with a table. Notice how each of the columns has an arrow on it, and we can sort based on an ascending sort or a descending sort. We can filter data out with different criteria. We can only see certain vendors if we want, or we can see, as we're seeing now, all of them. So you can play around with working with this type of data. It comes in very handy, and I'm sure it will come in very handy for you in creating spreadsheets in business applications.